September 1942, Dowfield, Bangor, Maine. A sharp Atlantic wind cut across the airfield as 10 young airmen stood beneath the silver wings of a brand-new Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, their breath fogged in the chill morning air, their eyes fixed on the massive machine that would soon carry them into the heart of war. At the center of it all was Captain Robert K. Morgan, a tall, lean pilot from Asheville, North Carolina. He ran his hand across the cold metal skin of the bomber, serial number 4124485, feeling the tiny rivets that held together tons of aluminum and hope. The aircraft had been officially added to the U.S. Army Air Force's inventory on July 15, 1942, and by September, it was assigned to the 91st Bombardment Group, none of the men standing. On that runway could have imagined that this very bomber and this very crew would soon become one of the most legendary names in American aviation history, not because of glory or fame, but because of their ability to survive against odds that no statistician could justify. Before heading across the Atlantic, Morgan made a promise to his men, a personal detour before war swallowed them whole. They turned their bomber south and flew to Tennessee, to a city that would soon give the aircraft its immortal name, Memphis. There, Morgan decided to christen his plane after his girlfriend, Margaret Polk. He'd first wanted to name it Little One, his private nickname for her, but after watching a film where a riverboat was called Memphis Belle, he changed his mind. The name stuck, and Margaret unknowingly became a symbol of courage for every man who would board that plane. Her smiling portrait would later be painted on the nose of the aircraft that faced death over Europe. The Memphis Belle departed for Prestwick, Scotland on September 30, 1942, stopping briefly at RAF Kimballton on October 1st, and finally arriving at its permanent base, RAF Bassingbourn, England, on October 14th. Nestled in the calm countryside of Cambridgeshire, this airfield would become their home for the next 7 months. But what awaited them was far from peaceful. The skies over Europe were a meat grinder of steel and fire. The statistics were brutal. When American bombers began operating from England, losses reached as high as 82%. Captain Morgan later described it in grim simplicity. 80% losses means you have breakfast with 10 men and dinner with only 2 of them. The War Department had set a rule: complete 25 combat missions and you could go home. But in those early days of late 1942 and early 1943, surviving 25 missions seemed like a mathematical miracle. Among the crews who flew those first tours, only 35% lived to finish. On November 7, 1942, the Memphis Belle and her crew took off on their first mission, a strike against the German submarine pens at Brest, France. It was the beginning of a journey that would test their nerves, their faith and their will to live. The engines of the Memphis Belle roared to life beneath the cold, misty skies of England. In the darkness before dawn, the bomber rolled down the runway at RAF Bassingbourn, joining a tight formation of B-17s headed toward occupied Europe. The men had trained for months, endless drills, precision checklists and bombing runs over safe skies, but no amount of training could truly prepare them for what awaited beyond the English Channel. The U.S. Army Air Forces entered World War II with a bold new strategy: daylight precision bombing, a concept developed at the Air Corps Tactical School in Maxwell Field, Alabama. The idea was simple in theory: strike key targets with surgical accuracy during daylight, when visibility was best. But there was one fatal flaw at no long range. Escort fighters had been built into the plan. The British Royal Air Force had warned the Americans that daylight raids without fighter cover would mean catastrophic losses. They had learned that lesson the hard way, and soon the Americans would too. At first, P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Spitfires provided escort, but their range was short. As soon as they reached the western border of Germany, they had to turn back, leaving the bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone. 2 days after their first combat mission, on November 9th, the Memphis Belle and her crew were back in the air, heading for St. Nazaire. Then again on November 17th. The targets were brutal: submarine pens at St. Nazaire and Brest, shipyards at Wilhelmshaven, rail depots at Rouen, and aircraft factories in Antwerp. The German U-boat pens, carved from reinforced concrete, were nearly indestructible. Even after direct hits, they stood firm, defying the relentless pounding from the 8th Air Force. But the Americans kept coming, again and again. By December, winter had taken hold of England, but the missions never stopped. On December 6th, they bombed locomotive works at Lille, France. On December 20th, they struck the airfield at Romilly-sur-Seine. Each mission felt like a roll of the dice, and with every return, the men counted the empty parking stands at Bassingbourn. Each vacant spot meant another bomber and another crew that wouldn't come home. The Memphis Belle herself took a beating that defied logic. On 5 separate occasions, she returned with engines shot out. Once her tail section was nearly torn away. Her fuselage was riddled with bullet holes, and shrapnel from anti-aircraft flak ripped through her frame. Yet somehow, through all of it, not one crew member suffered a major injury. It was as if fate itself was watching over them. The new year, 1943, brought no relief. On January 3rd, they were back over Saint-Nazaire. On January 13th, Lille again. And on January 23rd, they attacked the submarine pens at Lorient. That mission nearly destroyed them. As the Belle approached the target, she flew straight into a wall of flak and fighters. German Messerschmitts tore through the formation, and the sky turned into chaos. Morgan kept the Belle steady, flying straight through exploding shells and smoke. They didn't dodge, and they couldn't. Any sudden move might throw off the bombing run. By the time they broke through the clouds, the bomber was shuddering, torn and smoking, but still flying. And just as the crew caught their breath, a new kind of visitor arrived at RAF Bassingbourn in late January 1943. Not soldiers, but Hollywood filmmakers. Among them was Major William Wyler, the celebrated director behind Wuthering Heights and Mrs. Miniver. He had come to capture the reality of these men, not actors, not fiction, but real Americans risking everything in the deadly skies over Europe. Director William Wyler, the man behind Mrs. Miniver, had joined the U.S. Army Air Forces with one mission: to document the air war over Europe as it truly was. No actors, no staged scenes, just real men flying into danger every single day. Captain Robert Morgan later wrote in his memoirs that Wyler approached him in late January 1943, shortly after the Memphis Belle's 8th mission. Wyler told Morgan that there was something special about his crew, a sense of legend forming even before their story was finished. The name Memphis Belle already carried a mystique, and Morgan himself had earned a reputation as one of the calmest, most skilled pilots in the 91st Bomb Group. Wyler believed that if he flew with Morgan, he'd be in the center of the action, with at least a fighting chance of coming back. At first, Wyler had planned to follow another crew, Captain Oscar O'Neill's B-17, nicknamed Invasion Second, of the 401st Bomb Squadron. But fate intervened. On April 17, 1943, O'Neill's bomber, along with 5 others, was shot down over Bremen, Germany, the costliest raid yet for the 8th Air Force. Wyler needed a new focus, and so the lens turned toward the Memphis Belle. By now, Morgan and his crew were veterans of countless missions. On February 4th, they struck Emden, Germany, their first assault deep into German territory. 10 days later, on February 14th, they bombed Ham. And just 2 days after that, the Memphis Belle took severe battle damage over Saint-Nazaire. Ground crews worked around the clock to repair her torn fuselage and shredded control surfaces. While they did, Wyler filmed his first mission on February 26, 1943, not aboard the Belle, but on another B-17, the Jersey Bounce. That raid on Wilhelmshaven, Germany, was brutal. German fighters swarmed the formation, tearing through the bombers. 2 B-17s from the 91st Group were shot down. Wyler, sitting behind his combat camera, captured it all. Despite the danger, he refused to stop. Over the following months, he filmed 6 more missions with Morgan's crew, mounting cameras in the nose, tail, waist, and radio compartment to record the war from every angle. But documenting the truth came at a terrible cost. Lieutenant Harold J. Tannenbaum, a World War I veteran and one of Wyler's cinematographers, was killed in action on April 16, 1943, when his bomber was shot down over France. Wyler himself suffered frostbite and temporary hearing loss from the extreme cold and concussive blasts aboard the bombers. Meanwhile, the Memphis Belle kept flying. March brought missions to Lorient on the 6th, Rouen on the 12th and 13th, Wilhelmshaven again on the 22nd, and back to Rouen on the 28th. April saw more deadly targets, Antwerp on the 5th, Lorient on the 16th, and that same catastrophic Bremen raid on the 17th that had claimed O'Neill's crew. Then in May, the Belle flew to Saint-Nazaire on the 1st, and Antwerp again on the 4th. By mid-May 1943, the crew stood on the edge of history. Only a handful of bombers had ever reached the end of their combat tour. The race was on. Which plane would be the first to complete 25 missions? The B-17F Delta Rebel No. 2 achieved that milestone on May 1, 1943, becoming the first in the European theater to do so. Soon after, Hell's Angels of the 303rd Bomb Group hit the same mark on May 13th, but neither would return to America. It was the Memphis Belle, undamaged crew, unbroken spirit, that the War Department chose as the symbol of survival, courage, and hope. She would be the one to fly home and show the American public what their sons were enduring over Europe. Tragically, Delta Rebel No. 2 would not live to see that day. On August 12, 1943, during a mission to Gelsenkirchen, Germany, the bomber was shot down. 6 crew members were taken prisoner, and 4 were killed in action. The Memphis Belle, by contrast, still stood, scarred, battered, but undefeated. Her legend was only beginning. May 15, 1943. The Memphis Belle took off for her 24th combat mission, heading once again toward Wilhelmshaven, Germany. Just one more mission stood between the crew and the end of their combat tour, the number that meant survival, home, and peace. Director William Wyler was there, filming every tense moment. His cameras captured the faces of the men who had somehow beaten the odds time and again. Wyler quietly told Captain Robert Morgan something chilling before takeoff. If the Memphis Belle goes down on her final mission, I have a backup crew ready. Hell's Angels from the 303rd Bomb Group, their story will finish yours, but fate had other plans. May 17, 1943, the Memphis Belle roared into the sky for her 25th and final mission, targeting the massive Karaman submarine base at Lorient, France, one of the most heavily defended sites on the Atlantic coast. For hours, the crew fought through flak bursts, smoke, and enemy fighters. When they finally turned for home, the skies behind them burned with fire. After 148 hours and 50 minutes of combat flight, covering more than 20,000 miles, the Memphis Belle had done the impossible. During those 25 missions, her gunners shot down 8 enemy fighters, claimed 5 more as probable kills, and damaged over a dozen others. The crew dropped more than 60 tons of bombs over France, Germany, and Belgium. They had survived, and in doing so became living proof that it was possible to finish a tour over Nazi-occupied Europe. Every member of the crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and 3 oak leaf clusters. Only Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan received the Purple Heart, the sole official combat wound among them. The very next day, May 18th, the crew was invited to Buckingham Palace. Wearing the blue uniforms of the U.S. Army Air Forces, 10 young Americans stood before King George VI, dressed in his Air Marshal uniform, and Queen Elizabeth. The royal couple congratulated them personally for bringing the war to Nazi Germany, and for coming back alive. On June 8, 1943, Captain Morgan led the Memphis Belle back across the Atlantic for her next mission, a 31-city war bond tour across the United States. A composite crew was chosen by the 8th Air Force, but Morgan insisted that his original co-pilot, Captain James A. Verinis, join him. Verinis had flown only the Belle's first mission before being promoted to command another bomber, the Connecticut Yankee, completing his own 25-mission tour on May 13th. Now, he returned to the Belle's cockpit for her triumphant flight home. The crew that finished the tour was a snapshot of America itself. Ordinary young men from across the nation, aged 19 to 26, each with a different story but one shared fate. When they finally reached Asheville, Morgan's hometown, the celebration turned personal. A grand reception was held at City Hall where each crewman spoke. In his speech, Morgan, still wearing his flight jacket, smiled and joked about mountain moonshine, promising to fly it across the country once the war was over. The crowd roared with laughter. For a night, war felt far away. The Memphis Belle had come home, not just as a plane but as a symbol of courage, teamwork, and the faint but unbreakable hope that the war could be won. These young men, most barely out of their teens, had become living symbols of American courage. Everywhere they went, crowds gathered in awe. People lined up just to touch the aircraft's metal skin, trace their fingers over the bullet holes, and see the scars of battle. They wanted to meet the men who had faced death 25 times and returned home to tell the tale. Captain Robert K. Morgan, pilot, Asheville, North Carolina. Age 24, Captain James A. Verinis, co-pilot of Woodbridge. Connecticut Captain Charles B. Layton. Navigator, Flint, Michigan Captain Vincent B. Evans. Bombardier, Fort Worth, Texas Tech Sergeant Robert J. Hansen. Radio operator, Walla Walla, Washington Tech Sergeant Harold P. Locke. Top turret gunner and engineer of Green Bay, Wisconsin Staff Sergeant Cecil H. Scott. Ball turret gunner, Arapahoe. North Carolina Staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan. Tail gunner, Yonkers, New York Staff Sergeant Casimir A. Nastel. Waist gunner, Detroit, Michigan Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Winchell. Waist gunner, Oak Park, Illinois. Notably missing from the celebration was Staff Sergeant E. Scott Miller, the right waist gunner from Kingwood, West Virginia. He had flown 15 missions aboard the Belle, but hadn't yet completed his tour. While his crewmates toured America as heroes, Miller stayed behind in England, quietly finishing the fight. His sacrifice and service would go largely unrecognized for decades. Also joining the tour was a little piece of home, Stuka, a small Scottish terrier bought by co-pilot Verinis in a London pet shop. Through the endless interviews, parades, and speeches, that dog became a reminder of normal life, something warm and alive amidst the memories of war. Across 32 cities, the Memphis Belle crew drew massive crowds. They weren't movie stars or generals. They were real men who had faced death and lived. Cities like Washington, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Wichita, and Mobile turned out in force. Streets filled with people waving flags, cheering, crying. When they finally reached Asheville, Morgan's hometown, the celebration turned personal. A grand reception was held at City Hall, where each crewman spoke. In his speech, Morgan, still wearing his flight jacket, smiled and joked about mountain moonshine, promising to fly it across the country once the war was over. The crowd roared with laughter. For a night war felt far away, the Memphis Belle had come home, not just as a plane, but as a symbol. Their symbol of courage, teamwork, and the faint but unbreakable hope that the war could be won. These young men, most barely out of their teens, had become living symbols of American courage. Everywhere they went, crowds gathered in awe. People lined up just to touch the aircraft's metal skin, trace their fingers over the bullet holes, and see the scars of battle. They wanted to meet the men who had faced death 25 times and returned home to tell the tale. The Memphis Belle War Bond Tour had 3 purposes. First, to inspire new combat crews in training, showing them that survival was possible. Second, to motivate factory workers across America, letting them see what their hard work had built and how it was helping win the war. And third, to remind the American public what their soldiers were fighting for on the other side of the ocean. But behind the cheers and parades, not everything was as perfect as it seemed. For Captain James Verinis, the tour became deeply personal and painful. Once a commander of his own B-17, the Connecticut Yankee, he had already completed 25 missions before Morgan did. Yet to the press and the public, he would forever be introduced only as the co-pilot of the Memphis Belle. Living in Bob Morgan's shadow was something Verinis silently endured for the rest of his life. The public wanted a single hero, and the story they were told gave them one. Captain Robert Morgan, the handsome, confident pilot from North Carolina. The rest of the crew, their teamwork, their shared suffering, all faded into the background for the sake of a simple, powerful headline. Even Morgan's relationship with Margaret Polk, the woman whose name had inspired the bomber itself, began to fall apart. What had started as a wartime romance, full of promise and hope, couldn't survive the pressure of fame and the emotional toll of war. By the end of the tour, their love story, the one America had romanticized, quietly ended. After 3 months of traveling across the country, the Memphis Belle's combat chapter came to a close. On December 23, 1943, she was reassigned to MacDill Field, Florida, serving as a training aircraft for new B-17 air and ground crews. The bomber that had survived German fighters and flak now helped others prepare for their own deadly missions over Europe. When victory in Europe, VE Day, finally arrived, her mission was over. The Memphis Belle was flown to Altus Army Airfield in Oklahoma, where she was parked among thousands of other bombers, silent giants waiting to be scrapped. The industrial might that had built them now had no need for them. For a while it seemed that the Memphis Belle would share the same fate, cut apart and melted down. But one man refused to let that happen. Mayor Walter Chandler of Memphis stepped in, arranging for the city to purchase the historic B-17 for just $350, less than the cost of fuel for a single mission. In July 1946, the Belle was flown home to Memphis and placed in storage. 3 years later, in 1949, she was put on outdoor display near the National Guard Armory by the city fairgrounds. But as decades passed, the proud warbird that had once defied death was slowly being destroyed by something far worse: neglect and time. The paint faded. The aluminum skin corroded. Vandals left their marks. Rain and sunlight stripped away her dignity. The Memphis Belle, which had once braved the flak-filled skies of Germany, was now dying silently on American soil. Then came hope. A Memphis businessman named Frank D'Onofrio began a relentless campaign to save her. After years of effort, the city finally agreed to donate land on Mud Island for a proper display. Major corporations stepped in. Federal Express and Boeing each contributed $100,000, while the city added another $150,000. When Hugh Downs featured the story on ABC's 2020, Americans across the nation opened their hearts and wallets, donating the remaining funds, totaling $576,000, needed to restore the plane. On May 17, 1987, exactly 44 years after she completed her 25th mission, the Memphis Belle Pavilion was officially dedicated before a crowd of nearly 25,000 people. 7 B-17s, the largest formation seen since World War II, thundered overhead, releasing thousands of rose petals over the pavilion. Among the crowd stood Margaret Polk and surviving members of the Belle's crew, watching as the sky filled with flowers and the crowd erupted in applause. It was a moment of redemption and triumph. The Memphis Belle had not only survived the war but time itself. The legendary Memphis Belle was finally getting the care and respect it had earned. After decades of neglect, the warbird that once symbolized hope was about to be reborn. Margaret Polk, who had tirelessly helped raise funds for its preservation, passed away in 1990, but not before seeing the aircraft she inspired finally being honored once again. Yet the outdoor display on Mud Island, though built with love and good intentions, could not protect the Belle from weather and time. It was clear that she needed a safer home. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force announced plans to take custody of the Memphis Belle for full restoration and permanent display at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. By mid-October 2005, the Belle arrived at the museum, not as the proud bomber she once was, but as a collection of corroded, fragile pieces. The Memphis Restoration Group had run out of money, and the aircraft had suffered heavily. What followed was one of the most meticulous restorations in aviation history, a project that would consume 55,000 hours of labor, more than 100 people, most of them volunteers, devoted years to bringing the four-engine bomber back to life. They weren't just restoring an airplane, they were preserving a national treasure. When the paint was stripped from the fuselage, the restorers made a surprising discovery: hundreds of names, initials and short messages etched into the metal. Over the decades, visitors had left their marks, small acts of reverence, a way to connect themselves to the famous plane and the men who flew her. Casey Simmons, one of the restoration specialists, explained that their top priority was getting it right. Every missing part, even those hidden deep within the aircraft, like a glycol heater inside the left wing that no one would ever see, was painstakingly rebuilt by hand. Many of these parts hadn't been manufactured in 70 years. In some cases, only a tiny fragment or a faded photo existed to guide the team. But still, they built, piece by piece, until the Memphis Belle stood whole once more. This wasn't just a restoration. It was an act of remembrance, a tribute to every man who had flown into German skies and never returned. On March 14, 2018, the Memphis Belle was carefully moved into the museum's World War II gallery. 2 months later, on May 17, 2018, exactly 75 years after completing her 25th mission, the restored bomber was officially unveiled to the public. When Robert K. Morgan Jr., the son of the Belle's pilot, saw her fully reassembled for the first time in 50 years, his voice trembled with emotion. His father, Captain Robert Morgan, had dedicated his life to ensuring that the Memphis Belle would be preserved. Morgan Jr. said his father knew before he passed away that the aircraft would find a permanent home in Dayton, and that knowledge had brought him peace. The documentary that started it all, William Wyler's 60mm color film, became an inseparable part of the Belle's legend. The original film had no sound. Dialogue and engine noise were added later in Hollywood. During the war bond tour, the actual crew members sat in a studio and watched their silent footage, speaking their lines as if they were back in combat. The result was so authentic that even experts could barely tell it wasn't real combat audio. Today, over 15 hours of Wyler's original footage rests safely in the U.S. National Archives. In 2016, filmmaker Eric Nelson discovered 34 reels of the raw color footage. His team restored the damaged film frame by frame, repairing scratches and fading, and used more than 90 hours of this material to create a powerful new documentary, The Cold Blue. The men of the Memphis Belle lived long after the war, but they carried its memories forever. Robert K. Morgan was injured in April 2004 after a fall at Asheville Regional Airport and died a month later, on May 15, 2004, from complications including pneumonia. James A. Varinas, his loyal co-pilot, passed away on March 3, 2003. Cecil Scott, the Ball turret gunner, retired from Ford Motor Company after 30 years and died in 1979. The others returned to civilian life, became husbands, fathers, grandfathers, ordinary men who had done extraordinary things. But the story of the Memphis Belle was never just about one airplane or one crew. It was about all who flew and all who never came back. During World War II, 350,000 airmen served in the 8th Air Force in England. Of them, 26,000 were killed, a staggering 7.42% mortality rate. By comparison, U.S. Marines, 3.29%, U.S. Army, 2.25% U.S. Navy, 0.41%. The airmen of the 8th Air Force suffered the highest losses of any American branch. In fact, more airmen died flying over Europe than the total number of Marines killed in the entire war, even though the Marine Corps had 250,000 more men, when measured just among the 10,000 air crewmen. The death rate soared to 12.38%, with 21,000 captured and sent to POW camps. Out of 250,000 bomber crew members, there were 58,000 casualties, including 18,000 killed, 6,500 wounded, and 33,500 missing. In the darkest months of 1943, if you were a bomber crewman flying missions over Germany, your chance of survival was just 1 in 4. Imagine flipping a coin and knowing that if it came up tails twice, you wouldn't live to see home again. The men of the Memphis Belle had defied those odds, not once, not twice, but 25 times. Some missions saw horrific losses, 30% during the Regensburg-Ploesti mission in August 1943 and 28% at Schweinfurt that October. After Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force halted deep raids into Germany until long-range P-51 Mustangs arrived to escort them. The Memphis Belle and her crew had faced the impossible and survived. Their story endures not only in museums and films, but in every act of courage that followed. The doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing had exacted a terrible price. It was brave, but brutally costly. For too long, American bombers had flown deep into enemy territory without proper escort, relying on courage and luck more than protection. That began to change with the arrival of a revolutionary aircraft, the North American P-51 Mustang. The P-51 had originally been built with an American Allison engine, but it wasn't until late 1942, when engineers replaced it with the Packard-built version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that the fighter became truly extraordinary. With this transformation, the P-51B was born and fast, powerful, and capable of flying alongside bombers all the way to Germany and back. When the first Mustangs began arriving in England in December 1943, the skies slowly began to tilt in favor of the Allies. Had the P-51 arrived just a year earlier, thousands of airmen's lives and perhaps tens of thousands might have been spared. For the campaign as a whole, the numbers told the story. The 8th Air Force lost 4,182 bombers out of 273,141 sorties, about 1.5% per mission. But that number was deceptive. When crews had to fly 25 missions, the odds compounded. Even a small percentage loss became a terrifying gamble with life and death. By 1945, the 8th Air Force had evolved into a far more effective striking force. Bombers flew lower, hit targets with improved accuracy, and delivered up to 60% of their bombs within 1,000 feet of their aiming point, nearly 4 times better. Then in the grim winter of 1943, the air campaign had succeeded. But its success was bought with blood. Captain Robert Morgan often said there was no such thing as an easy mission, no milk runs. Every flight meant facing flak so thick it looked like you could walk on it. Black clouds exploding all around them, shaking the aircraft, filling the sky with shrapnel. Then came the fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving in from the sun, their tracers slicing through the formation in waves. The gunners fought back, counting the parachutes of other downed crews, knowing that some would never open. At 25,000 feet, the world was frozen and unforgiving. Temperatures dropped to 40 to 50 degrees below zero. Frostbite was constant. Oxygen was scarce. Masks froze. The aircraft was unpressurized, a metal shell filled with men clinging to life. Waist gunners stood beside open windows, exposed to the screaming wind, gripping their 50 caliber machine guns as the aircraft rattled under enemy fire. The noise was unrelenting, a thunder of engines, guns, and explosions that left many men half-deaf for life. Through it all, the Memphis Belle crew endured. Morgan believed the key to survival was tight formation flying, so tight that sometimes the bomber wings nearly touched. It demanded absolute focus, perfect trust, and nerves of steel. One wrong move could mean mid-air collision, and death for everyone nearby. While the flight crews earned the headlines, the unsung heroes were the ground crews, the men who worked in freezing rain and mud, often with bare hands, keeping the bombers alive. The Belle's crew chief, Joe Jambrone of Hulnerville, Pennsylvania, replaced 9 engines, both wings, 2 tails, both main landing gears, and countless other components to keep her flying. He and his men performed miracles in the cold, often overnight, so that by dawn the Belle could rise again. Morgan always said that half the Memphis Belle's luck came from those men on the ground. Without them, no bomber, no matter how skilled the pilot, would ever return home. The Belle's survival was partly luck, but mostly skill, discipline, and teamwork. Each man aboard knew his role perfectly. Each trusted the others completely. That bond, forged in fear, cold, and courage, was what kept them alive. After the war bond tour ended, several of the crew still weren't ready to stop fighting. Kazimir Nastal, the waist gunner, returned to Europe after the publicity tour and went on to complete a staggering 60 combat missions. John Quinlan, the tail gunner, tried to join Robert Morgan again in the Pacific Theater, but was reassigned instead to the China-Burma-India front. There, flying as a gunner aboard a B-29 Superfortress, he shot down 3 Japanese Zeros, becoming a gunner ace before his aircraft was finally shot down. But they never forgot. They never forgot the cold, the fear, the thunder of flak, the sight of other bombers falling away in smoke and fire. They never forgot the friends who didn't come back. And in the end, the real story of the Memphis Belle isn't just about one crew or one airplane. It's about all of them. Every crew that flew, every aircraft that launched, every mission that helped turn the tide of the war. It's about the price of victory, measured not in bombs dropped or targets destroyed, but in lives forever changed, in sons and brothers and fathers who never came home. The Memphis Belle stands silent witness to all of this, and every person who walks past her, gleaming, timeless, and still, should pause and remember what she represents: courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of those who flew into the flak-filled skies of World War II, and against all odds came home. But the Memphis Belle, through a mix of fame, luck, and decades of dedication by countless hands, survived. And because of that survival, new generations can see with their own eyes what these great aircraft truly were: their immense size, their complexity, their blend of mechanical genius and human courage. The 10 men who flew the Memphis Belle to complete her 25 missions were the lucky ones. They survived. They came home. They built families, lived quiet lives, and grew old. They were ordinary men who had done the impossible. And though the Memphis Belle would rest in a museum, their courage would never fade, living on in every flight that followed, in every young pilot who dared to take to the skies. For some men, surviving the impossible once wasn't enough. They went back to do it again. Captain Robert Morgan, having already defied death over Europe, volunteered for another combat tour, this time in the vast skies of the Pacific Theater. There he commanded a B-29 superfortress he named Dauntless Dottie, after his wartime sweetheart. On November 24, 1944, Morgan led the first B-29 raid on Tokyo, flying at the head of a formation that symbolized a new chapter in aerial warfare, one that would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The story of the Memphis Belle isn't just about machines and missions. It's about people, ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things. None of these men were born heroes. They were farm boys and factory workers, students and salesmen. Some volunteered, others were drafted. They went through hurried training and found themselves at the center of the deadliest air war in history, thousands of feet above enemy lines, where courage was measured one mission at a time, and they rose to the challenge. When asked about their service years later, almost all of them refused to call themselves heroes. They deflected praise, spoke humbly about just doing their jobs, and emphasized the efforts of others, the ground crews, the support staff, the men who didn't come home. That humility, that quiet sense of duty, was the mark of their generation. They didn't seek glory. They simply did what needed to be done. But history remembers them differently. They proved that daylight precision bombing could work, though the doctrine had to evolve, and the cost was staggering. They gave a battered world something to believe in. In the dark, uncertain days of early 1943, when bomber losses were unsustainable and morale was fragile, the Memphis Belle crew became hope. Their survival wasn't just a statistic, it was a message. That it could be done, that you could fly through hell and make it home. Today, the Memphis Belle rests in honor at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Fully restored, the bomber stands as a symbol, just as iconic for the Air Force as the flag raising on Iwo Jima is for the Marines or the USS Arizona Memorial is for the Navy. The aircraft sits with its bomb bay doors open, propellers gleaming, and its signature nose art perfectly recreated. Mission markers and fighter kill symbols line the fuselage, every rivet and panel restored to how it looked on that May Day in 1943, when the Belle returned from Lorient for the last time. But the real Memphis Belle isn't the polished artifact in a museum. It isn't the Hollywood movie version with a perfect ending. It's the story of young men, barely out of their teens, climbing into cold aluminum bombers again and again, flying into the most heavily defended skies in history. Men who knew with brutal clarity that the odds were against them. Men who did it anyway. That's what makes the Memphis Belle's legacy so powerful. It wasn't just one crew's survival. It was what their survival meant. In late 1942 and early 1943, when crews were being lost at terrifying rates and hope was fading, the Memphis Belle kept flying. They kept surviving, and that made them more than just an aircraft and a crew. It made them a symbol of possibility. When they finally returned to the United States, they carried that hope with them. At every war bond rally, every factory visit, every training base, they stood as living proof that survival was possible, that courage and discipline could overcome impossible odds. They were, in every sense, flying propaganda, but propaganda built on truth. They had done it. They had survived. And in doing so, they gave every crew still waiting on the airfield something priceless: belief. The Memphis Belle stands today not just as a plane, but as a memorial, a living monument to every man who took to the skies in the strategic bombing campaign of World War II. This single aircraft survived missions when survival itself seemed statistically impossible. It carried 10 men through some of the most ferocious anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition ever faced. and it brought every one of them home. The men who flew her never called themselves heroes. But that's exactly what they were, and the Memphis Belle, beautifully restored and eternally honored, ensures that their story, and the stories of thousands like them, will never be forgotten. When visitors walk through the quiet halls of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, and they see this gleaming aluminum bird restored to its precise 1943 configuration, they're not just looking at an airplane, they're looking at a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, and of the terrible cost of freedom. Every rivet, every bullet hole repaired, every flak scar polished away, tells a story of men who faced death not once, but again and again, and did it willingly, because it was their duty. The Memphis Belle represents all those other bombers that did not return. It represents the tens of thousands of airmen who never made it home, whose names are carved into memorials across Europe, whose stories ended in the cold skies above Germany, France, and the North Sea. It represents the courage it took to climb into those fragile aircraft day after day, knowing the odds, knowing the cost, and doing it anyway. The legacy of the Memphis Belle reaches far beyond the Second World War. It helped shape how America understood air power, how it viewed strategic bombing, and how it remembered the men who risked everything in the skies. It became part of the American story, a timeless chapter in the epic of the greatest generation. Its fame inspired books, films, and documentaries, capturing the imagination of Americans in 1943, and still doing so today. The aircraft itself is one of only a handful of B-17 air flying fortresses still in existence. Most were scrapped after the war. Some were left to rust on forgotten airfields. A few became static displays stripped of their identity. But the Memphis Belle, through a mix of fame, luck, and decades of dedication by countless hands, survived. And because of that survival, new generations can see with their own eyes what these great aircraft truly were. Their immense size, their complexity, their blend of mechanical genius and human courage. The 10 men who flew the Memphis Belle to complete her 25 missions were the lucky ones. They survived. They came home. They built families, lived quiet lives, and grew old, but they never forgot. They never forgot the cold, the fear, the thunder of flak, the sight of other bombers falling away in smoke and fire. They never forgot the friends who didn't come back, and in the end, the real story of the Memphis Belle isn't just about one crew or one airplane. It's about all of them. Every crew that flew, every aircraft that launched, every mission that helped turn the tide of the war. It's about the price of victory, measured not in bombs dropped or targets destroyed, but in lives forever changed, in sons and brothers and fathers who never came home. The Memphis Belle stands silent witness to all of this, and every person who walks past her, gleaming, timeless, and still, should pause and remember what she represents: courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of those who flew into the flak-filled skies of World War II, and against all odds came home.